We are often taught that when the legions of Rome breached the gates of Alexandria, they brought with them a storm of fire and steel, but hidden behind that martial glory was a shadow far more terrifying. A silence so profound that it did not seek to end a life, but to inventory a living god as mere property. This is the story of Cleopatra's final humiliation in the suffocating heat of August. 30 BC. The victorious Octavian commanded his soldiers to preserve the fallen queen, for a dead enemy offers no spectacle in a Roman triumph. Thus, the palace was transformed not into a slaughterhouse, but into a gilded cage where every breath was measured, and every dignity was systematically stripped away by the cold machinery of bureaucracy. Before we unlock these sealed doors, do subscribe to join our ranks, and whisper in the comments from which city you are witnessing this history unfold. Imagine, if you possess the fortitude to do so, the atmosphere of Alexandria on the 1st of August, in the year 30 BC. The air does not smell of smoke, nor does the wind carry the copper tang of blood that usually accompanies the fall of a dynasty. Instead, the royal quarter is suffocated by a silence that is far more unnerving than the cacophony of siege engines. When Octavian's forces breached the city, they did not come as marauders intent on pillage, but as administrators arriving to audit a bankrupt estate. The transition was terrifyingly seamless. There were no screams echoing from the ramparts, no fires consuming the great library, only the rhythmic, mechanical clatter of Roman hobnailed boots marching in perfect formation across the sacred alabaster floors of the Ptolemaic palace. For Cleopatra, who had sat upon the throne of the Nile for 2 decades, this was not a military defeat, but a spatial redefinition of her existence. The palace, once a sanctuary of absolute power where her word was law, was instantaneously transformed into a high-security holding facility. The soldiers who entered her private chambers did not look at her with the lust of conquerors, but with the cold, assessing gaze of warehouse managers. They were not there to violate her person, but to secure an asset to Octavian, the man who would become Augustus. Cleopatra was no longer a monarch, nor even a woman. She was a specimen, a rare and exotic creature that needed to be kept breathing, kept pristine, and kept legible for the grand catalogue of his triumph. As the ancient historian Plutarch recorded with chilling precision, the instructions given to the centurions were absolute and paradoxical. They were commanded to treat the queen with the utmost deference, yet to ensure that she possessed no means of exercising her own will. One can almost hear the heavy breathing of the legionaries as they stood guard at every threshold, their presence a constant, physical violation of the queen's privacy. They moved through the gilded corridors, not with wonder, but with suspicion, overturning cedar chests and shaking out tapestries, searching not for hidden gold, but for the instruments of death. It is here that the true horror of her situation begins to dawn. The Romans knew that for a ruler of her caliber, death was a final act of sovereignty, a way to deny the enemy his prize. Therefore, the first act of this occupation was the systematic confiscation of dignity. Servants were pushed aside, their protests silenced by the flat of a gladius. As rough hands searched through the queen's personal effects, every sharp object, every small knife used for fruit, every silver hairpin that might be driven into a vein, and every vial of strange liquid was removed, catalogued, and taken away. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of unwashed wool and leather from the soldiers, overpowering the delicate frankincense that had perfumed these rooms for generations. Consider the psychological weight of this surveillance. Cleopatra was not thrown into a dungeon. She was trapped in the mockery of her own home. She was allowed to walk through her gardens, but only within a perimeter defined by the spears of her captors. She could recline on her couches, but she could not be alone. The privacy that defines royalty was stripped away, layer by layer, until she was left naked before the unblinking eye of Rome. The ancient chronicler Dio Cassius notes that even her food was inspected before it touched her lips, not merely to prevent poisoning by an assassin, but to ensure she did not consume poison by her own hand. The food taster, once a symbol of royal paranoia, became a jailer ensuring her survival against her will. This was a siege of the mind. The soldiers didn't speak to her, they spoke around her. They occupied her space with a terrifying indifference, turning the sacred chambers of the Isis incarnate into a guardroom where they gambled with dice and cleaned their weapons. The clinking of their armor, the murmur of Latin slang, and the heavy thud of their shifts changing became the new soundtrack of her life. It was a calculated display of dominance. By ignoring her authority, by treating her requests with a bureaucratic delay rather than outright refusal, they were dismantling her identity. She was learning, hour by agonizing hour, that she was no longer the protagonist of her own story. The walls of the palace seemed to shrink with each passing day. Rooms that were once hers were sealed off, one by one, designated as quarters for the Roman staff. Her world, which once stretched from the sands of Syria to the coast of Cyrenaica, was now reduced to a suite of rooms, then to a single chamber, and finally, to the confines of her own mind. In this claustrophobic environment, the silence of Octavian was the loudest weapon of all. He didn't come to gloat immediately. He let her wait. He let the uncertainty rot her resolve. He understood that the anticipation of the end is often more breaking than the end itself. For the attendants who remained with her, the loyal Charmian and Eros, the horror was doubled. They watched their mistress, a woman who had charmed Julius Caesar and commanded Mark Antony, be reduced to a prisoner in her own velvet chair. They saw the flicker of desperation in her eyes as she realized that her charm, her intellect, and her wealth were useless currencies in this new economy of survival. The Romans were immune to her. They were following orders that had been drafted weeks ago in a tent far from the seduction of Alexandria. This was the machinery of empire at work, grinding down a human being into a political symbol. As the sun set on those first few days of August, the reality of the golden cage settled in. There were no chains on her wrists, but the weight of Rome was pressing down on her chest. She was being preserved, pickled in the brine of anxiety, kept fresh for a date that had already been circled on a calendar in Italy. The humiliation was not in the violence, it was in the preservation. They were keeping her alive so that she could die at the exact moment that suited them best. In front of a cheering crowd thousands of miles away, this was the invasion of silence, the slow, suffocating tightening of the noose that was designed not to kill her body, but to extinguish her spirit long before her heart ceased to beat. If the invasion of the palace was the physical conquest, then what followed was a far more insidious dismantling of the soul, a process we might call the Specimen Protocol. To the Roman clerks who now scurried through the royal corridors with their wax tablets and styluses. Cleopatra 7th. Cleopatra was no longer the pharaoh, nor the incarnation of Isis. She was merely an inventory item, a high-value asset that required specific maintenance conditions to prevent depreciation before the final sale. The brutality of this phase lay not in what they did to her body, but in how they recategorized her existence. In the official dispatches sent back to Rome, her royal titles were meticulously stripped away, replaced by cold, descriptive nouns such as the Egyptian woman, or, even more chillingly, the captive. This bureaucratic erasure was a form of psychological torture that left no bruises, yet it shattered the mind more effectively than the rack. The Romans understood that to break a queen, one does not need to beat her. One simply needs to subject her to the trivial indignities of the common prisoner. Consider the daily ritual of correspondence in a desperate attempt to secure safety for her children. Cleopatra penned letter after letter to Octavian, using the nuanced Greek of a diplomat, pleading, bargaining, and offering the vast treasures of the Ptolemies, but the response was a weaponized silence. Her messages were not rejected, which would have at least provided a certainty of doom. Instead, they were absorbed into the void of Roman administration. A guard would take the scroll with a face of stone, and days would pass, long, suffocating days where the passage of time was marked only by the shifting shadows on the wall. This was a calculated strategy of hope and delay. By refusing to give her a definitive answer, Octavian kept her trapped in a state of perpetual anxiety, a limbo where she could not grieve because she still hoped, and she could not act because she was paralyzed by waiting. The intrusion into her private life became absolute. The ancient sources hint at a level of surveillance that bordered on the medical. The Romans were terrified that she might conceal poison, not just in her food, but on her person. Thus, the sanctity of the royal body was violated under the guise of security. Every morning, her robes were shaken out, her jewelry boxes, once containing the heirlooms of a dynasty, were turned upside down by rough, calloused hands searching for the smallest vial or the tiniest hairpin. Even the application of cosmetics, a ritual of immense cultural and personal significance to an Egyptian queen, was supervised. Imagine the humiliation of having a foreign soldier inspect your coal jars and perfume bottles, dipping his fingers into the sacred oils to ensure they were not agents of death. It was during these invasive inspections that the food taster became the ultimate symbol of her imprisonment. In the days of her glory, a taster was a shield against treachery. Now, he was a barrier to the only escape route she had left. Every meal became a cold, clinical procedure. She had to watch as another human being chewed and swallowed her food, waiting the requisite minutes to see if he would convulse. Only then, when the food was cold and the appetite had long vanished, was she permitted to eat. It was a daily reminder that she did not even own the right to die. She was being force-fed life, kept breathing against her will like a rare beast in a menagerie throughout this ordeal. The only anchors preventing her from drifting into total madness were her loyal ladies-in-waiting, Eros and Charmian. These two women, whose names deserved to be etched in iron alongside their mistress, witnessed the slow erosion of the god-queen they adored. They were the ones who saw the trembling of her hands when the guards weren't looking. They were the ones who smelled the fear that even the strongest incense could not mask. In the shared silence of their confinement, they formed a tragic triumvirate, bound together by a loyalty that Rome could not comprehend and therefore could not break. Yet, even their presence was used against her. The Roman officers would occasionally separate them, questioning the handmaidens in separate rooms, not with torture, but with insidious whispers, asking if the queen had been acting strangely, if she had hidden anything, if she had spoken of self-destruction. This created a paranoid atmosphere where every whisper could be misinterpreted, every glance analyzed. The palace had become a panopticon, a glass prison where the prisoner feels watched even when she is alone. As the days dragged on towards the middle of August, The Specimen Protocol began to yield the results Octavian desired. Cleopatra was exhausted. The sleepless nights, the irregular meals, and the crushing weight of the unknown had sapped the vitality that had once captivated the most powerful men in the world. She sat in her chambers, surrounded by the ghosts of her ancestors, while just outside the door, the machinery of the Roman triumph was already grinding into motion. They were measuring her for chains, not iron ones, perhaps, but golden ones, designed to glitter in the Roman sun. And they needed her to be docile enough to wear them. This was the true nature of their care. They were not preserving a human being. They were polishing a trophy. On the 3rd of August, the heavy doors of the royal apartment were unbarred, not for a servant, but for the architect of Cleopatra's ruin. Octavian entered. The meeting between these two historical titans was not, as romantic painters have often depicted, a dramatic confrontation of equal powers. Rather, it was a sterile, chilling inspection of assets. Ancient accounts describe the room as being meticulously cleared of any weapon, leaving Cleopatra, dishevelled and feverish, to face a man who possessed none of Julius Caesar's charisma, nor Mark Antony's passion. Octavian was a creature of a different breed entirely, cold, calculating, and terrifyingly composed. He did not look at her as a woman. He scanned her as an auditor scans a ledger, checking for defects, calculating the remaining value of a depreciating property. Cleopatra, desperate to salvage some fragment of her dynasty, attempted to deploy the formidable charm that had once brought Rome to its knees. She spoke of her past loyalty. She presented financial records with trembling hands, and she offered to open the vast treasuries of Egypt to fill the coffers of the Roman state. But Octavian remained impervious. He sat, likely with his legs crossed and his face unreadable, listening to her pleas with the polite detachment of a magistrate hearing a petty theft case. He did not debate her. He simply noted her statements. When he spoke, his voice was not raised in anger, but levelled in a monotone that was far more frightening. He offered vague reassurances, promises so empty that they echoed in the silence of the room like dropped coins. He told her she would be treated with all due respect, a phrase that, in the lexicon of Roman conquest, is merely a euphemism for a gilded cage. But the true horror of this meeting lay not in what was said about her, but in the unspoken verdict regarding her children. Here, we must tread carefully into the darkest shadow of Roman pragmatism. Cleopatra was a mother of 4. Her eldest, Caesarion, born of her union with Julius Caesar, represented a biological and political paradox that the Roman Empire could not tolerate. In the eyes of history, the boy had committed no crime other than existing. However, in the ruthless calculus of imperial stability, his existence was a fatal error. As the philosopher Arius Didymus whispered into Octavian's ear, "Too many Caesars is not good." We must understand this not as an act of wanton cruelty, but as a grim necessity of Roman law. If Caesarion lived, Octavian's own claim to be the heir of Caesar would be forever contested. Thus, the order for the boy's removal was given, not with malice, but with the stroke of a pen, a final administrative cleanup to secure the foundation of the coming empire. Caesarion was intercepted during his flight to the Red Sea and silenced. We will not dwell on the method of his end. Let it suffice to say that he was simply erased from the equation, a loose thread snipped by the shears of fate. For the remaining 3 children, Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus, the fate was arguably more haunting than death. They were not to be executed, for Rome did not slaughter children without cause. Instead, They were to be absorbed. Octavian viewed them not as heirs to the Ptolemaic throne, but as living props for his triumph. They were valuable only in their capacity to be displayed. Imagine the mother's realization as she looked into Octavian's eyes and saw not mercy, but ownership. She understood then that her children were no longer hers. They were state property, destined to be paraded through the dust of Rome, chained in gold, to elicit the roar of the mob. This realization shattered whatever illusion of negotiation remained. Cleopatra saw that her survival would not protect her children. It would only guarantee their humiliation. If she lived, she would walk in chains, and they would walk behind her. A pathetic procession of a fallen house. The Roman plan was to transport the entire family to Italy, to strip them of their Egyptian identity, to raise them as Romans, and to let the bloodline of the pharaohs dissolve into the vast, grey sea of the empire. It was a fate of cultural annihilation. The children would survive. Yes, but they would survive as strangers to their own history, forgetting the language of their mother, forgetting the gods of their fathers, becoming merely footnotes in the biography of their conqueror. The inspection ended as abruptly as it had begun. Octavian stood, adjusted his toga, and left the room without a backward glance. He believed he had pacified her. He believed that by promising her life, he had secured her compliance. But he had made a critical miscalculation. He had underestimated the resolve of a woman who saw herself not as a captive, but as a goddess. In his cold arrogance, he failed to see that by taking away her future, her children's sovereignty, he had liberated her from the fear of death. He left her in that room with the silence, thinking he had won. He did not know that the moment the door clicked shut, the countdown to the final act had truly begun. The atmosphere in the palace shifted after that meeting. The air grew heavy with a finality that the guards could sense but not understand. Cleopatra stopped pleading. She stopped sending frantic letters. She became eerily calm, the kind of calm that descends upon the sea before a hurricane. She requested permission to visit the tomb of Mark Antony one last time, a request Octavian granted, thinking it a harmless indulgence of a grieving widow. He did not see it for what it was, a farewell ritual, a closing of the circle. She was preparing to exit the stage, not on Rome's terms, but on her own. The pawns had been moved, the king had been checked, and now the queen was preparing to topple the board entirely. Time, which had dragged so agonizingly slow for weeks, suddenly accelerated. Rumors began to filter through the palace walls, whispers from sympathizers, or perhaps intentional leaks designed to break her spirit, that the transport ships were ready at the harbour. The order had been given. In 3 days, Cleopatra and her children would be loaded onto a vessel bound for Rome. The timeline was no longer abstract, it was absolute. This was the catalyst. Cleopatra knew that once she stepped onto that Roman deck, her agency would evaporate completely. The ocean would become her prison cell, and the horizon would offer no hope of rescue. She had to act within this rapidly closing window, executing a plan that required the precision of a military campaign and the silence of a prayer. On the 10th of August, a simple peasant arrived at the gates carrying a basket of figs. The guards, confident in their total control, checked the basket. They saw only fruit, plump, dark, and sweet. They didn't see the instrument of liberation hidden beneath the leaves. Whether it was the legendary asp, coiled and silent in the darkness, or a hollow hairpin filled with a potent toxic compound, matters little to the outcome. The specific mechanism of her departure is a detail for historians to debate. The intent is what concerns us. It was not a desperate act of fear, but a calculated strike of defiance by choosing the moment and method of her end. Cleopatra was effectively telling Octavian that while he might own the world, he did not own her. The discovery of the body was a scene of frantic, impotent chaos when the Roman officers finally burst into the chamber. Alerted by a letter Cleopatra had sent to Octavian moments before the end, they found their prize already beyond reach. She lay upon her golden couch, arrayed in her royal regalia, finally immune to their orders. Octavian's reaction was not sorrow, but the cold fury of a collector who finds his most valuable artifact shattered. He summoned Silly, snake charmers and healers, in a desperate, ghoulish attempt to suck the poison from her veins, to drag her back from the underworld to serve his political needs. But the queen remained stubborn in her repose. She had successfully escaped the Specimen Protocol. However, Rome does not accept defeat easily. If the physical body of the queen could not be paraded, then a substitute would have to be manufactured. And this brings us to the most grotesque chapter of this saga, the triumph. Months later, back in the capital of the empire, the streets were lined with hundreds of thousands of cheering citizens. They screamed for the blood of the Egyptian witch, eager to see the woman who had seduced their generals. But what rolled past them on the heavy wooden cart was not a woman in chains, but an effigy, a life-sized wax statue, painted with uncanny realism, depicting Cleopatra in the throes of death, with a snake clinging to her arm. Consider the macabre nature of this spectacle. The crowd cheered for a doll. They hurled abuse at a piece of moulded wax. It was a hollow victory, a theatrical performance designed to mask the fact that the real enemy had outwitted the state. But walking behind that soulless effigy were the very real, very terrified children of the queen, Alexander Helios and Ptolemy Philadelphus, dressed in the heavy robes of a dynasty that no longer existed, were forced to walk in the shadow of their mother's false image. They were the living evidence of conquest. Small figures dwarfed by the roaring machinery of Roman propaganda. This visual, the fake mother and the real orphans, encapsulates the entire tragedy. The effigy was the lie Rome told itself, that it had captured and tamed the wild East. The children were the truth, that Rome had simply swallowed a family whole. As the procession wound its way up to the Temple of Jupiter, the transition was complete. Cleopatra's history was no longer written by her own hand. It was being sculpted by her enemies. The substitution was successful. The real woman, with her intellect, her languages, and her administrative genius, was buried in Alexandria. The woman who entered history that day was the wax doll, the tragic, suicidal seductress, a character invented to serve a Roman narrative. And as for the children, after the applause died down and the crowds dispersed, they vanished into the fog of history. They were handed over to Octavia, the sister of the man who conquered them, to be raised in a Roman household. They were educated, fed, and assimilated. The boys, Alexander and Ptolemy, disappear from the records entirely. Perhaps they died of illness, or perhaps they were simply allowed to fade into obscurity. Their names forgotten so that the peace of Augustus would remain undisturbed. Only Cleopatra Selene survived to become a queen in her own right in faraway Mauritania, carrying the silent memory of those final, suffocating days in the palace. The Roman soldiers had finished their job. They had catalogued the treasures, secured the province, and processed the human assets. The files were closed. The Egyptian question was answered, but in doing so, they left behind a stain that 2,000 years of reign could not wash away. The memory of a cold, administrative cruelty that proved, once and for all, that the pen of the bureaucrat can be far more brutal than the sword of the legionary. The story usually ends in the mausoleum, with the serpentine hiss of the asp and the stillness of the queen. But for the true victims of this tragedy, the nightmare was only just beginning. We must now turn our gaze to a chapter often redacted from the heroic chronicles of Rome, the fate of the orphans. Imagine, if you will, the sensory overload of 3 royal children, Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus, dragged from the perfumed silence of the Alexandrian palace onto the heaving, vomit-stained decks of a Roman transport galley. For weeks, the Mediterranean became their dungeon. These children, who had once played in gardens watered by the Nile, were now subjected to the brutal indifference of the open sea. The rolling of the ship was not a lullaby, but a constant, nauseating reminder of their displacement. They were surrounded by the very soldiers who had occupied their home, men who spoke a harsh, guttural tongue that sounded nothing like the melodic Greek or Egyptian they were raised with. Every wave that slapped against the hull carried them further from the only reality they had ever known, and closer to the heart of the beast that had swallowed their mother. When they finally arrived in Rome, they were not greeted as guests, but processed as raw materials for the upcoming spectacle. The city of Rome in 29 BC was a sensory assault, a labyrinth of brick and marble, choked with the smoke of sacrificial fires and the roar of 1,000,000 souls. The children were kept in holding cells, likely in the villa of a Roman magistrate, where they were scrubbed, measured, and dressed. But they were not dressed in Roman togas to blend in. They were deliberately costumed in the exotic, golden robes of the Ptolemies. This was a calculated theatrical choice. Octavian needed them to look distinct, alien, and royal, so that the Roman mob would understand exactly how high a dynasty had fallen. Then came the day of the triumph. Historians often describe the pomp and glory, but let us view it through the eyes of a 10-year-old girl, Cleopatra Selene. The heat was oppressive, radiating off the cobblestones. The noise was a physical wall, a cacophony of trumpets, drums, and the rhythmic chanting of the legions. But rising above it all was the baying of the crowd. Hundreds of thousands of Roman citizens lined the Via Sacra, their faces twisted in a mixture of hatred and ecstasy. They spat, they jeered, they threw refuse, and walking through this gauntlet of hostility, weighed down by heavy golden chains that were essentially fetters disguised as jewelry, were 3 terrified children. Ahead of them rattled the cart carrying the wax effigy of their dead mother. Imagine the psychological scar of that moment, forced to march behind a grotesque, melting parody of your own parent, while a city screams for her destruction. They were walking in a funeral procession that was being celebrated as a party. The shame was designed to be total. It was intended to burn the Egyptian identity out of them through sheer trauma. Every step toward the Temple of Jupiter was a step away from who they were. But the physical chains were eventually removed. It was the invisible chains that would bind them for the rest of their lives. After the triumph, the erasure entered its final, most sophisticated phase, assimilation. The children were placed in the household of Octavia, the sister of the emperor, and, ironically, the former wife of their father, Mark Antony. This was not an act of charity. It was an experiment in re-engineering. Inside the Roman villa, Egypt was forbidden. The names of their gods, Isis, Osiris, Horus, were replaced by Jupiter, Juno, and Mars. Their native tongue was silenced, suffocated by the strict grammatical structures of Latin. They were taught that their mother was not a hero, but a cautionary tale of excess and immorality. They were forced to study the very histories that justified their own conquest. This is the ultimate violence of empire. It does not just kill the body, it colonizes the mind. Alexander Helios and Ptolemy Philadelphus, the 2 boys, simply fade from the record during this period. There are no gravestones, no obituaries. Did they succumb to the Roman fever? Did they die of broken hearts? Or were they quietly eliminated when they reached an age where their bloodline might inspire a rebellion? The silence of the archives is deafening. They were likely neutralized, not by the sword, but by the shadows, removed from history because they served no further purpose. Only Cleopatra Selene survived the process. She learned the lesson well. She adapted. She wore the Roman stola. She spoke the Roman tongue, and she married a Roman client king. Juba II, she became a successful ruler in Mauritania, minting coins and building libraries. But even in her success, she was a construct of Rome. She was a safe version of her mother, cultured, royal, but ultimately subservient to the power that had destroyed her family. This is the true dark history of the conquest. It wasn't just the soldiers in the palace. It was the slow, grinding machinery of cultural annihilation that operated for years after the surrender. Rome didn't just want to defeat Cleopatra. They wanted to ensure that no one like her could ever exist again. They achieved this by taking her children and turning them into Romans, proving that the most effective way to destroy a legacy is not to burn it, but to rewrite it from the inside out. As we stand amidst the ruins of the Ptolemaic dream, looking back through the distorting lens of 2 millennia, a chilling realization begins to take hold. The tragedy of Cleopatra is not that she died. Death is the inevitable taxes of mortality. The tragedy is that she was edited. The Roman soldiers who entered her palace in those final, suffocating days of August did not merely capture a queen. They captured the narrative. They understood a truth that modern dictators have since perfected, that to truly conquer an enemy, one must not only stop their heart but also silence their ghost. Octavian didn't need to be a butcher because he was a bureaucrat. He knew that ink stains deeper than blood. By reducing a multilingual strategist, a naval commander, and a divine monarch into a specimen to be catalogued, managed, and finally replaced by a wax doll, he achieved the ultimate victory. He turned a human being into a cautionary tale for Roman matrons. The Cleopatra we think we know, the seductress, the tragic lover, the woman defined solely by the men she shared a bed with, is not the woman who breathed and fought in Alexandria. That woman was filed away, archived in a dark room that no historian holds the key to. And this leaves us with a final, unsettling thought to carry into the night. If the most famous woman in history could be so thoroughly rewritten by the administrative machinery of her enemies, what does that say about the rest of the past? How many other voices have been suffocated not by violence, but by the quiet, scratching sound of a scribe's pen, erasing the truth one line at a time? History, it seems, is not a window into the past. It is a wall, and on that wall, the victors paint whatever they wish us to see. The rest is just silence.